Today I wanted to show you guys what to expect if you're thinking about using Rubio Monocoat to finish your furniture pieces. We've all seen Rubio used for big slab tables or epoxy pieces, but rarely for anything like normal furniture that has joinery or any sort of complexity. I started using Rubio about 6 months ago, and I've used it on maybe half a dozen projects so far. And despite the couple of mess ups you'll see me have in this particular project, it remains my absolute favorite for two specific reasons that are really important to me. I can continue working in the shop while the finish cures, meaning I don't have to worry about dust and whatnot getting into the finish. And it's almost impossible to mess up if you keep it simple, which I did not, but more on that here in a minute. Now, if you don't know already, Rubio is a one-coat hard wax oil finish. You literally just wipe it on and wipe it off and walk away. But some of that time that you save by not having to put multiple coats of finish or clear coat on your project should be spent on sanding. I cannot stress enough how important sanding prep is, especially if using a darker colored finish on a lighter colored wood, because you will end up seeing all the little pigtails and scratches when all is done. Kind of like what happened to the edge banding on my workbench. Rubio says not to go any higher than 180 grit, which is a little hard to get used to at first as we're all accustomed to sanding to about 220, but if you do it right, you won't have any problems. If I could offer any advice here, it would be to maybe don't sand pieces that will be focal points, like tops and faces of components, with a fresh sanding disc, because a fresh disc can sometimes be a bit too aggressive. Sometimes I opt for a slightly used but not damaged disc for these types of areas because it can be a little more gentle. Also, if you're using a vacuum attached to your sander and have the ability to turn down the suction, turn down the suction. This will help keep the sander from really digging into the material. And if I'm really concerned about how perfect I want it to look, I will shine a light across the surface to reveal any imperfections or problem areas. And when all else fails, sanding with the grain with a sanding block loaded with 180 grit sandpaper will usually take out any unwanted marks and even everything out. It's also really important to try and remove all the glue squeeze out from around the joints, which can be quite the challenge with open grain woods like ash or oak, but most glues will end up showing through the finish, so do your best to remove it all beforehand. A sharp chisel usually takes care of this, followed by custom sanding blocks. I made these two blocks to get inside corners, with one side of the square block being specifically cut at an angle that matches the taper of the legs. That way it would sit tight into the corners. Now that this has been mostly a sanding tutorial so far, let's move on to cleanup. I like to hit all the surfaces with a brush attachment on the vacuum, and a small paintbrush is a great tool for getting into tight corners to get rid of all the dust that gets jammed in there. Instead of soaking deep into the wood, Rubio bonds to the surface essentially, and it can't do that very well if it has a layer of dust between it and the wood, so it's important to get rid of all the dust that you can. Next, I'll clean up the whole piece with a heavy amount of acetone. This will help pull any leftover dust off the surface and help pull a lot of it out of open grain as well. Rubio does sell a raw wood cleaner, but I haven't used it personally, and from everything I've found online, Rubio themselves suggest acetone over mineral spirits if you aren't using their cleaner. That being said, try to pay close attention as you're cleaning to look for any glue that didn't get all the way removed, which will just show up basically as a slightly different color than the wood color. Now, I wanted to use two Rubio products on this project. Smoked Brown Precolor Easy, which is a water-based stain that colors the wood, and Oil Plus 2C in Walnut, which is the hard wax oil finish itself. Immediately after applying the Precolor to the tabletop, I had a feeling that I had made a bad decision. Unlike the Oil Plus 2C, the Precolor dries very quickly and is extremely prone to lap marks. The only way I could prevent lap marks or blotchy spots is to use a lot more than I thought I should have needed, and then hurry up and wipe the excess off. It's worth noting again, though, that the Precolor is water-based, so these characteristics do kind of make sense. Here I have a picture frame and some samples with white and black Precolor that worked really well and gave me very little trouble, if any, when I applied the Precolor. So I'm not exactly sure why I had so many problems with this table, but I don't recommend using the Precolor on a project you care about unless you do a lot of testing on your own first. I did some research regarding this issue and found that 1, Precolor Easy can be thinned with water, and 2, it's helpful to keep the product wet and chase it with a slightly damp rag to spread it evenly. So I tried both of these things, and while it did help some, I ran into a couple of more issues. The first issue I noticed is that the color itself became muted, which was going to be a problem in this case because the top and the drawer face had already been treated and the colors wouldn't have matched up right. The second issue is that it's almost impossible to stain one face of any one component without inevitably touching a mating face or component and leaving a small amount of color behind, which will eventually be stained again, causing lap marks and blotchy spots where certain areas now have different amounts of stain. If for some reason that doesn't make any sense, just think of coloring on a white piece of paper with markers. It's the same concept. I just did the best I could with what I had and tried to keep the product as wet as possible and worked in small sections. I eventually decided to apply a second coat to try and even everything out, but I still did end up with some weird blotchy spots and some lap marks on some of the corners. Oh, and remember when I said to make sure you get all the glue squeeze out you can beforehand? Well, I intentionally left some on the internal corners to show you guys exactly what to expect if you don't. Once the Precolor was dry, I came back to do the Oil Plus 2C. This can be done with or without accelerator, and the results will be the same either way except for the overall cure time, which is a week with the accelerator and 3 weeks without. Also, you can use the furniture piece within about 24 hours if you use the accelerator. The ratio here is 3 parts oil to 1 part accelerator, and it's probably better to measure instead of weigh, but I couldn't find anything in the shop to measure with, so I opted for weight. And with this small of an amount, it really isn't that big of an issue, especially since the back of the can quite literally says approximately 3 units A to 1 unit B. I like to apply Oil Plus 2C using small sections of this 12 by 18 inch white floor buffer pad. This pad is only around $11 at my local home center, and it lasts a really long time when doing smaller projects like this because you only need a small chunk per project. To wipe up the excess, I like to use these white rags, mostly because they say professional white rags, and that makes me feel important, but also because they're really strong, really absorbent, and mostly lint-free. So because I'm a one-man crew around here, I don't have a whole lot of creative visuals for you guys on the application process, as it's hard to move a camera around when your hands are coated in an oily finish, but pretty much everything you need to know from here can be learned from this one shot. On big flat surfaces, a Bondo spreader could be really helpful to spread around a large amount of product, but with smaller stuff like this, dipping the buffer pad into the product and then buffing it in seems to work just fine. And it's important to note here that a little bit of product goes quite a long ways compared to traditional stains. Going back to the picture frame I showed you earlier, I literally just stirred the product in the can and then dripped it right onto the frame. With a normal stain, you'd need to use a lot more product and need a brush of some sort. After letting it sit for 3 to 5 minutes or so, I come back and wipe off all the excess product with the professional white rags. A general rule of thumb here is to wipe until your rags are clean and wipe it all off within about 15 minutes at the most. Admittedly, I wipe off until they're mostly clean, but what is more important here is to make sure that you don't leave any heavy coats behind or drips or any buildup in the corners, because the product will eventually solidify to a certain degree, and then you'll have to go back and repair those sections. Speaking of repairs, it's also super easy to make repairs to pieces finished with Rubio Monocoat, which is one of the things I really like about it. A few days ago, I spilled a bottle of black Precolor on my bench top, and while most of it did clean up with some acetone, I eventually decided to sand the damaged area back and apply new finish. It worked out perfectly, and it sure beats having to completely strip and refinish the entire surface like I would have had to have done if it was a traditional stain and film finish. I think it's easy to overthink stuff like this because Rubio does cost quite a bit more than box store stains, and even more than higher quality stains and top coats from, say, General Finishes and the like. But it really is the most foolproof finish I've used thus far. On something like this, you can work in sections that allows you to apply finish to one side, then another, and then come back and finish wiping off the first side, then finish another side, then come back and, you get it. But because there's no wet finish left on the surface, you can leave it curing in the shop and continue working on other projects too without worrying about dust and debris ruining the finish. Rubio claims that the finish doesn't stick to itself, which explains a part of the reason why it's so easy to make repairs. But the huge benefit to this while applying it is that it means there are no overlap marks or blotchy spots to worry about when varying amounts of product are absorbed into certain areas, like what happened with the Precolor. So here is the finished product when all is said and done. For those wondering, the solid wood drawer is made out of curly maple and finished with Rubio Monocoat's 5% white. 5% white means that it has a small amount of white added to it to neutralize the normal ambering effect that oil-based products typically have, and it does a really good job. As a whole, the project turned out decent, and its intended recipient, my son, couldn't care less about the couple of blotchy spots, this one bit of glue that I missed, or the saw marks on the leg that I somehow missed while sanding. I will say that if it was a paid client job, it wouldn't pass my personal inspection, and that's mostly because of the Precolor and partially because I'm a perfectionist. My advice is to leave the Precolor behind, at least for intricate work, and stick to the vast array of Oil Plus 2C colors to choose from. Follow the instructions and enjoy not having the headaches that come from more complicated finishes.